This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. Welcome to this week's edition of the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles. I'm going to take a bit of a sidestep into what I'm thinking about and what I'm doing because as accident would have it, I've been blessed with some new arrivals the last few days. In particular, two books have come out. One is called A Companion to Marx's Grandresa, which is a continuation of my attempt to make Marx's writings comprehensible to the world, and the Grundrisse was a particularly challenging text, but as several of you will have noticed in past episodes of the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, I frequently appeal to the Grandresa because it has a certain number of insights into how a capitalist mode of production works. And I've been particularly impressed with the way in which Marx uses the concept of totality. He doesn't really talk about this in his other writings very much, but in the Grundrisse, he emphasizes a great deal that he's going to be thinking about capital as a totality. And there are two ways in which you can think about that totality. One is the totality of capital as a mode of production, which is very much what I was talking about in past weeks. But also there is the totality of capitalism as a social formation. And that includes its history, its geography, its peculiarities, its oddities. But the idea there would be that the capitalist social formation has at its heart an engine, which is the totality of a capitalist mode of production. So this is the theme which is very much laid out in the Grundrisse, and it's just the theme of totality, and is something that I'm sure I will be coming back to. But I'm rather proud of this text because, as I've said, it's very difficult to write a comprehensible understanding of what Marx is doing in the Grundrisse because it's a set of notes to himself. He's using his own private language and his own private kind of thinking to survey the landscape, as it were, of a capitalist mode of production. And in doing so, he's writing some extremely complicated sentences, and sometimes it's hard to figure out exactly what he might mean. But I struggled a lot with it, and it was, for me anyway, I was very happy to see it finally in print. But the other text that has come to me about roughly the same time is a book about me. It's called David Harvey, A Critical Introduction to His Thought. And it's by Noel Castry, Greg Charnock, and Brett Christophers, who are three geographers of left persuasion, who thought that it was rather important to look at what I had been doing over the last 50 years or so of publication. And this is where the idea of totality comes in, because without being explicit about it, they're very emphatic that you really have to look at the works that I've been engaged upon, the many books I've written, from the standpoint of a totality. Now, what's the totality of what I'm looking at? Because many people will just read one aspect of what I do, whereas there are other aspects which are just as important. So David Harvey, A Critical Introduction to His Thought, is out there to be looked at, and I confess I have not yet read it. I'm not sure I'll be able to read it. The bits and pieces I have looked at, it's a very serious intervention to try to summarize the many things that I've done. And you will get in here the fact that I have approximately 30 books published. Some of them are a bit repetitions from earlier books, but there's about 30 books out there. And they have a great deal of variety in terms of the kinds of topics that they address. But within that variety, I'm actually concerned as these authors are, with trying to understand the totality. So one of the techniques I've always engaged in is to work very closely, of course, with Marx's theory. So a lot of texts are just theoretical texts, but always try to situate those theoretical texts in relationship to many of the things going on around. And I've been particularly concerned, of course, with questions of urbanization, uneven geographical development, kind of changing spatio-temporalities, things of that sort, so that the texts are actually inserted into a very general concern for those tangible historical and geographical phenomena which I'm trying to understand at the same time as I'm working with the theory. So there's in my mind, a sort of dialogue going on perpetually between theory and it's the meaning of that theory in relationship to events going on around us, like be it the foreclosure crises of 2007, 2008, or if it was the revolutionary movements of 1848 and 1871 in Paris and so on. So that it's putting those things together, which has been very important to me. And actually, I really came, in effect, to have more and more confidence in Marxist theory the more that I worked with tangible kind of manifestations. And initially, when I first started reading Marx, I was also involved. I just arrived in Baltimore in the wake of the uprisings of 1968, after Martin Luther King was assassinated. Much of the center of Baltimore was set to fire, and there was a lot of rioting going on in the streets, and a lot of the National Guard was brought in to sort of go past the university that I eventually got to, Johns Hopkins, to try to quell the violence going on in the city. So that this was the context in which I arrived in the United States, but it was a context in which I was beginning to be discontented with the general theoretical frameworks that were being set out in economics and the general theoretical frameworks that I was receiving from sociology, anthropology, political science. And I decided at that point to read Marx's Capital. And so I'm there. I am around 35 years old, newly arrived in the United States. So I decided to take a look at Marx's Capital, and I was not convinced that Marx's Capital was going to give me all that I needed to know. But I went through the following experiences, which I can briefly summarize, because I think this is one of the reasons why I started to think to myself, well, Marx had some things pretty well worked out, and I think the framework, the theoretical framework he was developing was, in fact, of considerable interest. So I was involved in this post 1968 inquiry as to what went wrong in urbanization, what went wrong and I became involved in a project in Baltimore to really talk about housing provision, the housing market, and the role that housing might have played in the kind of urban discontents which were being voiced right throughout the 1960s, in fact, and culminating, of course, in the revolutionary uprisings of 1968. So I'm involved in this research on housing provision, and the research was funded by federal monies, and I got to participate in it. And because I participated in it, and I just arrived from Britain, everybody looked at me and said, "Well, you know how to write, so you better write the final report of this research project." And we did a great deal of interview work with different institutions, the Federal Housing Administration. We talked to the financial institutions. We talked to landlord groups, and we talked to savings and loan institutions. And we talked, of course, to tenants and to the population in general. So we had a very general sort of trying to develop a very general picture of how the housing market in Baltimore worked, to what degree lack of housing provision and lack of affordable housing was part and parcel of the level of discontent in urban areas during the 1960s and what might be done about it. That was the general kind of framework. So I wrote this report on housing, and I started it off by talking about use value and exchange value. Now, those of you who are familiar with Marx's Capital will know that is where he starts off. He starts off with the idea of the commodity, and the commodity has a use value and exchange value, and you therefore start to dialogue between use value and exchange value in the housing market. So I thought this was an interesting way to start the report on housing, which was a report that was going to be circulated amongst housing officials, amongst the mayor's office, through the and financial institutions and the Federal Housing Administration and so on. So this was the sort of context. And so I wrote this thing, and I kind of said, well, housing has an exchange value, housing has a use value, and the bit of the problem in Baltimore is that when you look at how housing is provided, you're looking to the market system to provide housing, and therefore the exchange value is something which is going to have to be orchestrated in such a way that it is profitable for people to rent housing or buy and sell housing, and people have to have the money to do that. So the exchange value aspect of housing is terribly important. And then you can start to say, well, housing has a set of use values, and you can go through those. It's shelter, it's privacy, it's many aspects and ways in which house gets utilized. It's a place of sociality. It's a very often a protected space, sometimes not protected enough. But so you could talk at length about the use value of housing, and then kind of say, well, the problem in Baltimore is that the provision of housing is orchestrated through the exchange value, and it is not able to deliver the necessary use values for housing to the mass of the population to allow for, if you like, a stable social and political and economic situation. So this was, if you like, the sort of argument I started out with. And it was a bit like me taking the first few pages of Capital and projecting them into the study in this way. Well, I didn't mention Capital, of course, knowing full well the anti-Marxism and the anti-communism of everybody. So I didn't say a word where it was all coming from. I just used the concepts and laid out an analysis of the Baltimore housing market around the theme of use value, exchange value, and problems in the exchange value system, which were generating difficulties in terms of the use value of housing to the mass of the population. So this was how I did it, and everybody seemed, my research group seemed to be happy about it. They deferred to me on it, and so that was the nature of the report that we issued. And the report was sent to landlords in the city. It was sent to representatives from the housing financial sector, sent to people of the FHA, sent to people in the city council and to the mayor's office and so on. And we had a citizens planning organization which organized a sort of, in a sense, a day-long conference around this particular around the report that we had written, and it was full of a lot of detail on things like the role of housing inspectors in terms of preserving housing quality and all kinds of things like that. So it was quite an elaborate report, and in particular had something to say about the role of the Federal Housing Administration and its insurance policies in terms of funding what was going on in the city. And there were two things that came out of this, which were really rather critical for me. First was when you started to kind of say, well, who's to blame for the problem? You would say, okay, the biggest problem is that people are price gouging in housing markets. The rents are high. Landlordism is a problem. The landlords are extracting rents from impoverished populations, and so there are all sorts of things of that sort. You could say, therefore, landlordism was if you like, speculative activity in housing markets and things that were going on at the time, such as blockbusting, which was the way in which real estate operators were introducing people of color, African Americans, into a neighborhood and would start to sort of then scare all the white people on the block that this was soon going to become a black neighborhood. And so this would then lead people to sell out rather cheaply, and people would pick up, the real estate people would pick up the properties rather cheaply and then turn it and rent it out to a black population. So this was a kind of a manipulation of racial differences in housing markets. There was all kinds of things of that sort, where you could kind of say, well, this is the kind of practice that has to be regulated, has to be stopped, and there are ways in which the city can actually deal with it. So, but in effect, also when we went to the landlords, it was very interesting. The landlords were actually getting a very high rate of return out of renting housing in the central city. But they were getting a high rate of return because they needed a high rate of return because they couldn't get financing. Now, if you finance, you can do something called leveraging, which is rather nice thing to do. You borrow money at 5% and you rent out at 6%, and then on the let's say the $20,000 you put in, you get a rate of return of about 25%. So if you can leverage, if you can get access to funds, and at that point we kind of said, well, it's not the landlord's fault. The problem here is that the landlords cannot get access to good financing. So he went to the financial institution and said, well, you're to blame for the thing because you're not giving access. And they said, well, we're not to blame because the problem is that this is high risk investment. And it's so high risk. We don't actually invest in a city supportive in a city housing provision because we cannot get insurance on our activity. And it's at that point we kind of said, well, where's the insurance coming from? And at that point was the Federal Housing Administration that was supposed to offer insurance. But the Federal Housing Administration was not offering insurance on inner city housing. And at this point, you accuse the FHA of redlining, which had been outlawed during the early 1960s. And the FHA would say, well, no, we're not redlining. We're simply actually dealing with the fact that if we start to insure in high-risk communities, we'll lose a lot of money. And in Detroit, the FHA had lost a lot of money by actually investing and insuring housing in very low income areas. So and was therefore being investigated by Congress for profligate use of its resources. So the FHA was kind of saying, no, it's not our fault. It's the fact that the creditworthiness of that population is so low that no sensible person would want to insure it. So, in other words, what you start to move towards is an idea that there's no one person or one group that you can put the finger on and say, you're the problem. You actually talk about the totality. And the totality of it was that this whole kind of system is set up in such a way as to be unequal in its capacity to provide adequate housing to the mass of the population, and particularly to low-income populations. And so if you have a low-income population, where say 50% of the population in Baltimore is existing at a poverty level or less, then there's no way they're going to get access to decent housing. They're going to have to live in rundown housing worth almost nothing, which is going to be used by landlords insofar as they control it to extract a high rate of return, because the landlords you can't use leveraging. So you have a story of this kind. So the report built a story of this kind, and people were kind of, I think, quite impressed with the way in which we depicted the totality of the situation and the totality of the system, and how it therefore needed system-wide address. The same thing, by the way, happened with the city. The city had a housing code inspection, and that was a kind of fascinating. Because we spent a lot of time with housing code inspectors, and we found that they didn't actually inspect housing in the poorer areas of the city. And we said, well, why not? And they said, well, the experience we have is this: we go in and we see lots of things which are wrong. We give a citation, and the citation kind of says this has got to be fixed. And we come back in, I don't know, 3 months, and it's not been fixed. And so we then have to go to court, and the landlord says they can't do it because they haven't got the money and this kind of thing, and they get a rap over the knuckles. So nothing happens. Whereas if we, as housing inspectors, go to a respectable area, people immediately respond and immediately fix it up, and we get a lot of productivity. In other words, it's absolutely useless to send housing inspectors into low-income areas because nothing happens. Whereas if we send it into those marginal areas where maybe something's starting to deteriorate, then things get actually much better. So these were the kinds of things we were working with, and it was again about the totality, every aspect of it, which we tried to put together to talk about the system and the systemic problems which underpinned the fact that adequate housing provision could not be provided for a good 30 or 40% of the population of the city of Baltimore. So that was one of the findings, which was very useful. But the other thing that I found fascinating was that I started off by talking about this in terms of use value and exchange value. Everybody around the table thought this was a fantastic way to look at it. You know, I kind of said, yeah, this is a really interesting way to look at things. And one of the people who had been part of been one of the landlords who'd participated in an economic study, who kind of said, they came down from Penn and they had this big study of our functioning, and it was a really total waste of time. It was all about supply and demand and all those kinds of things, and that's all nonsense. But this idea, you can study this whole thing through the categories of use value and exchange value. That's a great way to do it. And then you kind of talk about, and the way you systematized the exchange value system and showed how it therefore did not work at all well in terms of provision and the low use values was great. So there we were, and there were the bankers and people from the FHA and the landlords and so on, actually loving this use value, exchange value framework, which I had set up, which was, of course, page 1 of Marx's Capital. And I felt like saying to them, do you realize this is page 1 of Marx's Capital? And I realized what a disaster it would have been had I done so. But for me personally, I was only on page 1 of Capital, really, and I found it therefore so interesting that the framework that Marx sets up for Capital, it provided such an intuitively interesting and fascinating way in which to approach a social problem. As long as you didn't say it had anything to do with Marx, you could really get away with it. And I was put it this way, I started to have much more confidence in the Marxian theory because the categories, when they were put to work in a situation of this kind, made so much sense to all of the people participating in the system, and they could see that it was making sense. So it was good. It was good to do. And I got a lot of, and so one of the things I then did was to say, well, if I can get this from page 1 of Capital, maybe I should go on to page 40 or something and find out what else I can get out of Capital, and that set me off with a great deal of confidence in exploring Marx's framework. And this then created a very interesting phenomenon a couple of years later, when there was another day-long conference pulled together by the Citizens Planning Association, and I was invited to go along. And one of the themes was about the role of urban renewal and urban refurbishment and so on, and doing something again about the housing problem, which is still a serious problem, and of course to this day continues to be a serious problem. So I was at this conference, and I had just been reading Engel's book, little book on the housing question, which he published in 1882. and it's a fascinating read for a variety of reasons, which I'm not really going to go into here. But one of the major themes that Engels uh, gets onto is the following, and his phrase is as follows. He said, the bourgeoisie has only one way in which it tries to solve its housing problems. It moves them around. It takes on an impoverished area, and it improves it, and it makes it fine. And everybody kind of then comes along and does a big opening, and the bourgeoisie congratulates itself for having solved the impoverished problem in this neighborhood, only to find that impoverishment has moved somewhere else in the city. So one of the things I did in Baltimore was to demonstrate that actually over the previous 30 years, public policies had done nothing more other than to move the problem around. So I was using the Engels theme to actually talk about, there have been certain improvements in certain areas of West Baltimore, and the result of these improvements was that the low income population had gradually disappeared to be displaced by what we would now refer to as a gentrified population coming into a neighborhood, and the real estate operators were busy working on this improvement, but of course, people were being expelled, as it were, by rising rents and rising property prices, and were moving northwards. And as they moved northwards, they were then caught up in this blockbusting movement, and actually, what was happening was on the northern side of this area of improvement, which was an area which is largely populated by the Jewish population. New York, Baltimore had a significant Jewish population, which was in the northwest of the city, but it was now being eroded by blockbusting as the real estate people came in and started to introduce black people into the housing mix, and there was something called a tipping point. And the tipping point was when about 40% of the population of a neighborhood became black. Then within about 3 years, it was 100% black. And that was the way in which things were working in the housing market at that time. And this was what was going on. In Baltimore, therefore, you could demonstrate that there was no solution to the housing problem. It had simply been moved around. And I used the Engels phrase, again, without mentioning this is all Engels at all. And at that point, some people on the city council had figured out that, or decided I was obviously a raving socialist, and that they had to go after me. So they started to go after me in this meeting as, these socialist ideas, blah, 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 blah. This is the sort of thing that still goes on around. And I was saying, no, we just have to deal with the fact that it's been moved around. It's undeniable it's been moved around. Look at the data, look at the information, look at, by the way, the secret redlining that goes on. Even the mayor at a certain point kind of said, yeah, we have a secret redlining in the city, and everybody claims it's because of creditworthiness, but in effect, there's a red line in the city within which no mortgage finance and no financing is available. So that's the situation. So people were recognizing it, but I was being accused. Now, on this occasion, what was interesting was the Citizens Planning and Housing Group invited the vice president of the Chase Manhattan Bank, who was in charge of real estate development and real estate redevelopment in New York City. And so he was in this mix. And when I was being attacked for being socialist and all the rest of it, he suddenly intervened and he said, no. He said, no, this guy is quite right, he said, because look, one of the biggest problems we have in New York City is we take on a poor, low-income neighborhood, and we set about improving it with all kinds of, mortgage finance and all the rest of it. And when we succeed, the problem is that we find that the people who we were originally trying to serve are no longer live there, and that they've had to move elsewhere. So this moving around is a very crucial question. And if you can't solve the moving around problem, you're not going to solve the housing problem. And I thought this was fantastic to have somebody from the Chase Manhattan Bank of, who didn't know anything about my work and didn't know anything about me either, to sort of actually support. So there I was being supported by vice president of the Chase Manhattan Bank for real estate development. And afterwards he says to me, "That's such a key insight, that moving around," he said, "that's the biggest problem we have in New York City. We just cannot do anything of this sort." So this was, and I tell him, "Yeah, yeah, well, this is a key thing." He says, "So where did you get that idea from?" And I thought to myself, shall I tell him or shall I not tell him? And then, finally I said to him, "Well, actually, I got it from Engels." He said, "Engels?" He said, "Oh, Engels, is he at the Brookings Institution?" He said. So, so I kind of laughed. I said, "No, this. I'm talking about Marx's friend Engels." And he said, "Oh," and then he shied away. But by then the damage was done. But again, the point here is that there are insights to be gained from reading Marx and Engels and so on about all of these kinds of things, which are so undeniable that you kind of go, I don't understand why it is that people have such difficulty in accepting it. And while they accept it entirely, as the guy from Chase Manhattan Bank did, and as all the people did about use value and exchange value and moving the problem around and so on, and what if people can see, well, this is a common sense, good sense way of looking at things, and a great way to look at things, why aren't they, why are they so reluctant to embrace somebody who theorizes about all of these questions in such a cogent kind of way? Now, Marx is, of course, not always terribly easy to read, but for people like me who have studied it, at least, we have the obligation, which is part of what I've been trying to do in the Grandresa book and in the other companions to Marx's Capital, and also in most of my writings as a totality, is to say, look, the theoretical ideas are terribly important, but they become even more important when you start to connect them to the events which are going on around us. And so you'll find nearly all of my books at a certain point have a kind of way of trying to take some aspect of the theoretical framework which Marx did, clean it up a little and make it a little bit more comprehensible, and then say, but look what insights this generates. And so I've have a book style, if you like, which does that. So that, for instance, in the Enigma to Capital, which is one of the books that I wrote and published back in 2006 or 7 or somewhere like that. In the Enigma of Capital, what I did was to start off with the first chapter called The Disruption. And the disruption was, of course, the crisis of 2007, 2008. So I talked through, what actually happened during that crisis. And then the rest of the book is trying to get at theoretical arguments to explain why that happened. And it's just so interesting that crisis is always kind of referred to as a financial crisis, when in fact it was a housing crisis. It began as a housing crisis, and it continued as a housing crisis, and continues actually to this day as a housing crisis, whereas the financial aspect got all of the attention, and the housing kind of nobody bothered with it, whereas I was kind of really, really concentrating very much on the housing. Now, in one of the later books that I have, which is Marx, Madness, and the Madness of Economic Reason, what I did there was to lay out the theory, and then right at the end kind of say, this theory works to explain much of the dynamics which has been going on in that period of between about 2009 right the way through to the beginnings of the COVID period. And to try to talk about how many of the insights which come out of use value, exchange value, moving the problem around, all those sorts of things can actually be discerned as foundational for understanding the totality of what a capitalist mode of production is about, and how that totality plays a role in the dynamics of a capitalist social formation. The capitalist social formation is much broader, much larger, much more disparate, and lots of particularities about it. But at the same time, there's at the heart of it, there is this engine, which you might call the accumulation of capital, and the dynamics of the accumulation of capital, and what Marx calls accumulation for accumulation's sake, production for production's sake, producing all kinds of economic and particularly in our period, environmental kinds of questions, in which you would realize that there's no way you're going to solve the climate change problem or make even a major contribution to its solution without at some point or other recognizing that it's this engine which is actually resting upon accumulation for accumulation's sake, which is about growth. And that, negative growth, and when the growth rate of capital is close to zero, you call it a crisis. Whereas, of course, what that means is very relatively benevolent for the climate change stuff, that at least you're not pumping out more pollution and more greenhouse gases. But right now we're back to pumping out those greenhouse gases, and the whole kind of thing about climate change is largely a lot of hot air, if you'll forgive the pun. So these works which I've been involved in have been always me trying to match together what's going on in the world around me, what's going on in capital in general, and trying to understand the role of the capitalist mode of production internal to this capitalist social formation, so that we better get a better grasp of what the origin of a lot of our problems are. And it's interesting that I took this whole kind of Engel's notion of you have only one way to solve the housing problem, which is to move the problem around. I started to apply that to environmental issues, environmental problems. I kind of said to people one day, look, there's only one way in which you deal with waste. You move it around. You either put it in the air, or you put it in the land, or you put it in the ocean. And if you take it out of the air, you've got to put it in the ocean. If you take it out of the ocean, you've got to put it into the land. And so, again, the only answer to the pollution problem is to move it around is a good way to start to recognize one of the issues. And then you come back and kind of say, well, in that context, we cannot look to one-shot solutions to pollution problems or one-shot solutions to the climate change problems. We have to go to the whole systemic roots of the nature of those problems. Now, these are the sorts of things, like I say, that I was most heavily involved in. And when I was asked one time, out of all the books you've written, what are the most important ones? My answer is, well, it's not a single one. It's two books. One was The Limits to Capital, where I really tried to work through in great detail the nature of Marx's theory of capital accumulation. In other words, the theory of the mode of production. And The Limits to Capital, to me, is still, if you like, one of the best things for me in terms of trying to understand the dynamics of the capitalist mode of production and what comes out of that. But I wrote that book in the context of doing this very detailed study of what happened in Paris between 1848 and 1871, between the revolutions of 1848 and the Paris Commune of 1871, and that transition, which was what went on in Second Empire Paris, what went on in the rebuilding of Paris. Why did the revolutionary movement of 1848 get actually solved by an urbanization kind of strategy, building the boulevards, rebuilding the city and all the rest of it, which created full employment, a completely different urban way of life, partly as a way of adjusting the capitalist social formation to the dynamics of the mode of production. And why was it that ran into contradictions in the late 1860s and then led into a political movement which produced eventually the Paris Commune, which is an attempt to create an alternative form of society in 1871. So again, I was fascinated by that, but I wanted to put it together with the theory. And it is the relationship between theoretical argument and between the historical, geographical conditions and situations, which has been very, very central to the way in which I have set out the totality in these 30-odd books that I've written in a lifetime. In fact, this pins them all together. They're all part of for me, they're all part of a seamless web. So I do appreciate what the writers of this book did, because what they did was to say, we're not going to sort of write a chronology. We're not going to write. We're going to try to break it down thematically into various aspects of the totality that are dealt with in different texts that I have written. So, like I say, it's a very serious attempt to grapple with how I use the concept of totality, and have been using the concept of totality in my own work, at the same time as I'm also directly confronting Marx's concept of totality in the companion to Marx's Grandresa, which again, for me, like I said, was a very important achievement, and one which I'm rather happy with, and very proud of, and not that people aren't going to dispute it. In fact, I'm expecting a great deal of disputation, but that's good. That's healthy. I think that that opens the door to a way of critiquing and understanding the most pressing issues of our time. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production.